everyone. Welcome to tonight's program, a discussion with Dr. Rebecca Hall about her graphic novel, Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts. I'm Marcia Eli from the Brooklyn Public Library's Center for Brooklyn History and the library's Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents. Tonight, I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Hall and her conversation partner, Dr. Nneka Dennie, to talk about a book that operates on multiple levels. It's a personal family story, a look at the work of the historian, diving into the archives. It exposes the paltry records and the resistance to changing the historical narrative as they relate to enslaved people and enslaved women in particular. And it's a celebration of the courage of the women leaders referred to in the title. You are really in for a compelling discussion. So before I introduce Dr. Hall and Dr. Dennie, let me share a few quick notes. First, we will put a link in the chat to the website of a local bookstore, the community bookstore in Park Slope, so you can, with a click, learn more about Wake. And here it is. If you would like to purchase a copy from a small local business. As with all Center for Brooklyn History talks, you have the option to engage closed captioning tonight. That button is at the bottom of your screen. And finally, you're invited to share your questions. Type them throughout the program into the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of your screen. So now let me say a word about each of our guests and hand it off to them. Dr. Rebecca Hall is a scholar, activist, and educator. After graduating Berkeley Law in 1989, she represented low-income tenants and homeless families for 8 years before returning to get her PhD in history. She has taught at UC Santa Cruz, Berkeley Law, Berkeley's History Department, and as a visiting professor of law at the University of Utah. She writes and publishes on the history of race, gender, law, and resistance, as well as on climate justice and intersectional feminist theory. She was currently a scholar in residence at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture and working on her second graphic novel on Black women and Reconstruction. And Dr. Nneka Dennie is an assistant professor of history and core faculty in Africana Studies at Washington and Lee University. She earned her PhD in African American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and completed her BA in Political Science with honors in Africana Studies at Williams College. As a Black feminist scholar specializing in African American intellectual history, her research interrogates the work of 19th century Black women thinkers. Dr. Dennie is currently at work on 2 books, Redefining Radicalism, The Rise of Black Feminism and the Politics of Respectability in the 19th Century, and Mary Ann Shadd Cary, Essential Writings of a 19th Century Black Radical Feminist. So Drs. Hall, Dr. Dennie, thank you so much for being here. I am very much looking forward to your conversation, and I will now disappear and hand it off to you.
All right, thank you so much, Marcia. Thank you as well to the Center for Brooklyn History. And perhaps most importantly, thank you so much, Dr. Hall, for the opportunity to be in community and in conversation with you tonight. I'm really excited to talk to you more about your book. Before we start, I just want to take a moment to show everyone in the audience this beautiful book cover, which has a bit of a glare on it from this light on my side. And this is, if it were not striking enough on its own, something I find beautiful as well about this book is that there's not simply this cover, but the hardcover also has some great illustrations on it.
Oh, you discovered that?
I did discover that. I sure did. Was this your decision? Was it an artistic decision?
No, I mean, it was my decision and Hugo's decision, and then Simon & Schuster's decision because it cost more money. The book came out at the same time in the UK on June 1st, and that company decided that that was too expensive, so they didn't do it on their version. So.
Okay, awesome. Well, I think a good place to start, I just want to share some stray observations I have about the book, as well as ask you some questions about your process, both in terms of the research and the writing. But there are a lot of things I appreciate with how you approached Wake, mostly because of the form. I personally am not too used to seeing graphic novels that are offering really rich history. And that's not to say that they don't exist, right? No offense to anyone out here writing awesome historical graphic novels, just that I myself have not personally seen them before. So I think that that's really fascinating and a very accessible way to present this important history that sometimes people might not otherwise have access to for one reason or another. I also appreciate the sort of spirit of Sankofa that I think your book is embodying, to go back and fetch it, and to learn from the past in order to help us shape a better future and understand the present as well. I think your book was also really instructive about sort of the process of doing history, in this way that seems deeply personal, right? I think that there are a lot of panels in the graphic novel where you're trying to go to these archives and they're turning you away for one reason or another. It reminded me of a piece that historian Dr. Ashley Farmer wrote about the experience of Black women in the archives confronting similar challenges to the ones that were depicted here. And the way that you highlighted some of the microaggressions or invisibility that you might be encountering in these different spaces seemed really significant. So thank you for this work that I think really allows historians to see themselves, as well as allows people to learn about this really, really important history.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's not I don't think it's a normal process to turn your dissertation into a graphic novel. A graphic narrative is the term I prefer more, because it's not really fiction, but graphic novel is the term, and but, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think my first questions for you really just have to do kind of with your inspiration, right? Like, how did you come to the study of history? And what was your inspiration for doing this project in this way, right? Like, what does this medium offer you that you felt like you might not be able to do with some other forms of writing?
Right. Okay. Yeah. I've always loved history. And I actually got a BA in history at Swarthmore College. And I wanted, even then, to go on and get a PhD in history, but I thought I would feel frustrated being in the academy, that I would feel like I was too divorced from the real world and its needs. And so that's when I decided to be a lawyer instead. And then went back to get the PhD in history. And I think why this medium? I love graphic novels. I always have, even, since forever. But I never thought that I would create one. And it's really different, like reading and appreciating something and then making it, but I wanted to get the work that I had done out into the mainstream and not just sort of trapped in academia, because I felt that what I learned was really important, and also important for understanding, what's happening in our country today. And so I started to do a lot of reading about sort of the methodology of graphic novels, and was just fascinated by the medium and what can be done in that medium.
Awesome. Yeah. So follow-up question in two different directions, both having to do with the types of with the work that informed this project, right? So can you tell us a little bit about some of the graphic novels that may have been helpful in you trying to conceptualize the way that you wanted to approach yours or your graphic narrative?
Yeah. Well, I really love Mouse by Art Spiegelman, especially the first volume of it. The subtitle is My Father Bleeds History. It's really powerful story about being the child of a Holocaust survivor. And I think that was probably, might be the main, the main sort of thing that I drew on as a like, oh, this is something that can be done. I mean, it's a very different project than mine, but I feel like I saw in it, things that could be done that you couldn't do in other mediums. Like one of the things in Wake that's really important is sort of putting the past up against the present and having them constantly sort of bumping up against each other. And I don't know of another medium that lends itself to that as well as a graphic narrative. Also, the graphic form, the graphic novel form, it takes like, linear text and then all at once art and creates a relationship that's very powerful. So it's very different than sort of like an illustrated history, or, sometimes you go into bookstores and you see like, Carl Jung illustrated or something, you'll see text and then you'll see some pictures, but they're not in relation with each other. And it's really important that they are in order to have this really kind of strong emotional valence that you can get from the medium. Mm-hmm. Like, and one of the things that that is really striking is this concept of the gutter. So like, if you want to see a film, if you want to see every frame of something, you would go see a film, right? But when you're doing a graphic narrative, you're having to decide what you're showing and its relationship to the other things you're showing. And there's the space between the panels is called the gutter. And so there's a lot of thought that goes into sort of the layout of that and how you approach it. And then once you sort of understand the methodology of the gutter, you can push it. So like in this example here, I'm doing research and have uncovered, that there were 4 women involved in the revolt in 1712, but I can't find anything about them. So, and if you can see that it kind of breaches the gutter and pushes up against me, so that creates that kind of visceral relationship. So yeah, I learned a lot about this and I love it. And I feel like everything I do now is going to be in this medium.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So how did you choose what images were going to like make the cut, right? Like if you can't have every single frame in, like you just mentioned, what was that process of sort of choosing some of these illustrations, how you wanted to really emphasize the kind of interplay that you were talking about between the past and the present? What did that process look like?
A lot of thinking and storyboarding. We actually, Hugo and I mean, Hugo, the illustrator, was a friend of a friend. And I had tried working with a couple of other artists before and it didn't work. But then our friend introduced us to each other and, I loved his work and he was very open to my ideas. I mean, in a way I kind of directed it, but also used his knowledge. I mean, he had never done a project like this. He had done a couple web comics. And when we met, he was a pedicab driver in New Orleans. And so, now he's doing this. So, but, I was writing the script. And as I was writing the script, I was thinking of like, what images, how can I tell this story that's coherent? But, it's fragmented because of the gutter situation, but the story itself is fragmented because the archives, what exists in the archives is so minimal, And I've always been kind of fascinated by like the shape of absence. Like, what does that look like? What can we understand by paying attention to it? And so for, again, this particular example, where I'm literally trying to look through the court records for the 1712 revolt and find out what's not there, and then what that means, both for now and also for then. And part of the sparsity of those documents is because if people at the time don't find something important or even like thinkable, they don't document it. And so the women involved in the revolt in 1712, their lives weren't, their testimony, what they were talking about, what why they were doing what they were doing, it wasn't documented. So yeah.
And as a reader, that was one of the frustrating things, because as you're depicting, you really traveling the world to try to go to these archives. I'm like rooting for your character in the book, right? I'm like, okay, this is going to be the time when Dr. Hall will triumph and find what she's looking for, right? I kept wanting that, but I think it really captured some of the difficulties that go along with doing research, or really specifically historical research on Black women, on Black women at such an early point in time too, right? Like I was really rooting for you, and I was waiting for like the golden ticket or something.
Right. Like one of those kind of Hollywood dramas, right? Where you
get that exactly
at the end. And, no, it's funny. I wasn't even planning to be in the graphic novel. But as I was beginning to create it, I realized I need to be in there in order to narrate what's going on, because this stuff is so fragmentary, and so much of the story isn't just the things that happened historically, but how history is thought about, how it's, preserved or not preserved, and, the issues you were just pointing out. So I put myself in the book in order to sort of narrate the story. And then once I did that, then I started writing about my experience, like my emotional experience of writing my dissertation, which it hopefully comes through in the graphic novel. It was really challenging, and I felt like, if I'm going to be in there and I'm going to be talking and I'm writing this, like, why write if you're not going to write what's true or what's painful, so that's kind of how that happened.
Well, now that you're speaking about how you were trying to depict some of your own emotions, something I hear a lot sometimes from students, for example, or people who are new to the study of history or the history of slavery, is like, well, how do you deal with like all this trauma, right? And so towards the end of your book, in chapter 10, you're talking a little bit about trying to heal this historical trauma. But I'm curious to hear from someone who really does study slavery, not just dabbles in it. Like, how do you cope with encountering such extreme violence and brutality when you're trying to do this work?
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard. I mean, it's not impossible, obviously. It takes a serious commitment. To me, it's so important for these women's stories to be told. And I, in the book, I talk about my grandmother, who I never met because she was so much older than me, who was enslaved, who was born in 1860. And, when I was writing my dissertation and going through all of this, I just thought about her so much. And basically I came down to the thing where it's like, if she survived slavery, I can research it, it seems kind of, and then I think there's this thing, which, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with too, as a historian, where when you're researching a subject that is difficult and traumatic, you can sort of build kind of defenses. And I think I talk about it a little bit in the chapter on the slave trade and slave ship revolts, where, I read like hundreds of captain's logs of, slave ship captain's logs. And, I had to create some kind of almost emotional distance between me and the subject. And I would do that. And then it would become kind of mind numbing, and then it would be like, people just being described as like, Negro woman 11 and, man slave number 12. And then, I would just hit on something, like I would go days and I'm like, okay, I'm just doing this and I'm not even thinking about it too much, right? And then I would see something and it'd be like, boom. And then it kind of hits all at once. And then, I'd have to like go rent a car and drive out into the countryside in England.
Yeah, I hear that. I feel like sometimes studying African-American history and teaching African-American history, like all of it is triggering, right? There's no way to get around it. In my classes, I normally issue a sort of blanket trigger warning because we're going to be dealing with various types of violence. We're going to be dealing with things that by all means are depressing and stuff like that. But at the same time, I think that I think that sometimes people desensitize themselves to it when they study it so much, as you were mentioning, right? Maybe people are going into autopilot. And then you sort of catch yourself because it's like, oh, wait a minute, right? These are real human beings who like we're looking at, who we're reading about and studying here. And so I feel like it can be easy to sort of get lost in the time to get work done aspect of it without creating the necessary space for humanity in that work.
Absolutely. No, I think that's true. But, it's also not all about, like the horrors of slavery. You know what I mean? Like there was, and I think that's part of my focus on resistance and revolt. There's a lot of this that's very inspiring. And I focus a lot on that. And, in terms of debate, there were a couple of scenes in the book, like the 1708 revolt in Elmhurst, what's now Queens, where I can't find the name of the woman who led the revolt. And all I ever got was like the Negro Fiend, so that's her name, and is that, she's burned at the stake, right? And I didn't want to show that. There was no need to show that. So I decided what I wanted to show instead was people who were forced to watch that, their faces, because I just don't want to keep like reinscribe these horrors by just sort of willy-nilly showing them, like you or discuss. Like I feel like that has to be done with a lot of thought and sensitivity, in order that we don't all get just. Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one is that not wanting to just get dragged down into the horrors of slavery and not able to see, anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. On a related note, I feel like one of the things that I really valued is the ways that you're able to highlight different types of resistance, right? So I know from reading your work, that one journal article that I give my students, as well as just some other texts like Stephanie Camp's Closer to Freedom, right? Like there are a lot of different things that constitute resistance, especially for enslaved women, that we might not necessarily recognize as resistance, right? Because people are thinking about revolts and people are thinking, as you write so wonderfully, that women don't revolt, right? People are thinking that women are not going to take up arms, even though we do see that happening as you document. But I think that even apart from those revolts, that you do a really excellent job of highlighting some of the subtler forms of resistance that also contribute to survival.
Like what are you thinking?
Yeah, so there are like community building, right? Yes. And these sorts of moments. There was one part, I think this was in one of the earlier chapters, where a woman is crying because she's pregnant and she doesn't want to have the child. And one of the other enslaved women says to her basically like, don't worry about it. I'll give you like some leaves for that to make a tea, right? And so those are the types of things that I'm talking about.
Right. And we had to research so hard about what are the abortifacients that were available and grew in New York in 1712. And what was drawn is actually, I can't remember the name of the plant at the top of my head, but that actually is the actual plant.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about things like that. And in probably in that same chapter, where a group of enslaved people are gathered together in the woods or by a well, I forget exactly which one it was, right? And then they say like, oh, we should get back before they come looking for us, right? And so those, I think that there are moments in there that are subtle that you might not recognize as forms of resistance if you're not already looking for general survival strategies, if you're not already thinking about community building and having these kinship relations with one another as things that help Black people to survive and resist slavery.
Right. Yeah, that scene you're describing is at the what's now called the African burial ground, and that the research that's been done there was a really important kind of sort of archival source for my work, my dissertation. We call it ground truth, like looking at the skeletons of, enslaved women who are buried there and look at all these sort of high status burials with, and practices that were similar to what was happening in Ghana at the time. And in New York in the early 1700s, the large majority of enslaved people were from what's now Ghana, were Akan speakers. The issue of burying your dead at this time period was very fraught because, the city kind of ended at Wall Street. It was a wall. The wall was built by enslaved people. They also built Trinity Church, which was, very old church, but they weren't allowed to be buried there. And so there was this, what at the time was called the Negro burying ground, outside of the city. And, there was so much tension about, no, they can't be there at night burying people. It's too dangerous. There's too much. So all of this sort of slave control stuff that, that was happening. But I think about the issue of resistance generally. And I think this is kind of fascinating, is that I got interested in this topic about women in revolt in particular, was because when I was studying slavery, and studying slave resistance, I kept encountering this, in book after book after book that was written about revolts, like this disavowal that women did this or participated in this in any way, and it was all within like the first 15, 20 pages of each book, and I was like, wow, people are really invested in this. Like, what's up with that, and, and I remember talking to my dissertation advisor, like, well, I want to research women in slave revolts. I mean, I know they must have been. She's like, well, I agree that they were there, but you're not going to find the sources. And, to me, that's like waving like a red flag in front of a bull. I'm like, watch me. It was this like 4-year research and writing process. It was, but so what I found out was why there was so much investment in this narrative that women didn't participate in this type of resistance is like, history is always written in like a social and political context. It's never just sort of out there unmoored to what's going on around. And, and I'm sure this as well, but, when the history of slavery was first being written, it was, I'm talking about the turn of the, 20th century, the basic mainstream thing was that slavery was a benign civilizing institution and there was no resistance at all, because why would people resist something that's good? You know, and that was all part of the lost cause mythology that was created at that time. And, you know, and then when people started, you know, when more radical people and African-American people and often men were trying to intervene in this narrative, they're like, yeah, there were revolts, and look at this revolt, look at this revolt. But at the same time that was happening, there was this kind of war on poverty discourse. You know, this is like, you know, late 60s, early 70s, you know, Black power kind of, you know, war on poverty discourse that, you know, the problem with Black people is not white supremacy or any of that. It's that their gender roles are dysfunctional, you know, and if, and Black women, because of the role they had as in slavery, which was matriarchal, they emasculate Black men. And so this, you know, this research is happening in that context. And so these historians are really like, and of course, Black women didn't emasculate their men by participating in this particular type of revolt. I mean, resistance. And, you know, I mean, some stuff was just, I mean, ridiculous. Like, you know, African women inhabited a separate private sphere in the New World as they had in the Old. Like, what kind of statement is that? Like, what, you know, I think I actually put that in the book. It's kind of subtle, so I don't know if people see it, but you can actually read it in a book that's on my desk. And so then, you know, again in the 70s and 80s, you know, and this is the same, you know, walk 10 steps behind your man. And, you know, Stokely Carmichael asked, you know, what's the role of Black women in the movement? And he says prone, right? I mean, so all of this is, you know, it's all part of that. And then you have the beginning sort of women's history or feminist historians who are saying, okay, well, if Black women were involved in revolt, they were involved in all these other kinds of resistance, like that you were talking about. And that resistance is just as important, and maybe even more so, because it was more effective. And, you know, but they never went back, you know, it is very important, but they never went back and challenged the original assumption. And so when I wrote this dissertation and then the article, it was really controversial. And you know, among some historians today, historians of slavery, it remains controversial. So I was really kind of like pushing boundaries when I did this. But since this book has come out, I mean, a lot of things have changed in our culture, and I think it has a lot to do with Xena, the television show, but that's a whole nother topic. No, but people these days are like, what? Of course. You know, what do you think? Women are going to stand there and when there's like life or death struggle and be like, whoa, you know,
clutching
pearls or whatever. Yeah, exactly. And so people today who read this, they're like, you know, I kind of jumped over that historiographical like wall. And then regular people are like, yeah, this makes complete sense to me, you know? So.
Yeah, like your book is as much talking back to some of this earlier scholarship as it is pushing the field in new directions to think about what Black women's unwomanly forms of resistance look like, right? And I think this is significant because it encourages us to think of how Black women's radicalism has taken shape as well, right? Which is slightly tangential, simply because these are things that I'm interested in myself. But I see some connections between the research I'm doing and this project, and that I think they're both trying to write women into histories that they've been excluded from when it comes to thinking about what Black women's resistance has looked like, right? I would say that armed rebellions are certainly forms of radicalism that, as you show, Black women have participated in. But because they were women, Black women don't get thought of as radicals in the ways that I think sometimes they should.
That's a very good point. Yeah. And I mean, that's something that interests me very much as well. I mean, the irony in this situation is that you also have people at the time, like slavers, slave ship captains and whatever, who also assumed that women would present no danger. And so that is why, before a slave ship left the coast of Africa, everyone was below deck and chained because they were concerned about cutoffs, like people coming and trying to, get the people, rescue the people off the ship, and et cetera. And but once the ship was at sea, the procedure, and I mean, this was regulated. It was a regulated business. I mean, it's literally in regulations. You can read it, that, that women were brought or unchained and brought on deck, for the kind of nefarious reason of having greater access to them. But it also gave these women access to the weapons, and mobility. And in the chapter, I sort of do excerpts from various captains' logs, but there's some, it's just like, there was another revolt today, and we checked the men's chains. We just don't know how it happened, and there was a whole range. I mean, some were very aware, like one person saying, like, if keep close eye on the women. If we hadn't done that, our property at this time would be but small, So what happened in the history, like historians, created this amazing database, the Transatlantic Slave Database, which you can go online. There's a website, and it's a searchable database, and it was kind of in the beginning of digital humanities, right? And they had scholars from all over the world who are researching the slave trade, and put all their records together. It's up to, I think, 35 or 36,000 slave ship voyages. And they found that there was a revolt on 1 in 10 ships. And then when they asked, these are quantitative historians, this is the kind of thing they ask, why is there, like, what's the difference between the ships that had revolts and the ships that didn't have revolts? And the only thing that was different was that the more women on a revolt, the more on a ship, the more likely there would be a revolt. And these historians immediately dismissed their own findings. They literally call it counterintuitive, because we know women didn't blah, 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 right? And so, yeah, it's just amazing how people sort of preformed ideas can just prefigure a field and erase, all types of, I'm sure you find this in your own research, Yeah.
So I think you've given us a bit of a rundown of some of the research that you feel your work is in conversation with, in terms of sort of highlighting where some of those gaps are. Can you tell us a bit more about some of the historical work that has informed your research, like some of the secondary scholarship or people who you think got it right in terms of looking at at enslaved women's history?
In terms of revolt?
Sure.
Yeah, literally at the time there was no one. I'm not just making that up. There was literally no one. There was, I started graduate school in 97, and the dissertation finished in 2004. The dissertation part, the research and the writing, like I said, was 4 years of that. And at that time, so the beginning of the 21st century, there was no book about women in slave revolts. There was a little bit of stuff in the Caribbean, because it's a little harder to obfuscate women's agency in revolt when you've got like Queen Nanny of the Maroons, and but even that was sparse. And in what became the United States, there literally was nothing. And there were incredible and are incredible historians, Black women historians who study Black women, and like you were talking about, like have done so much work in recovering all these forms of resistance, all these other forms of resistance. But in terms of revolt, no. And then when I published the article that I'm so glad you teach your students, because I was convinced like 10 people in the world have read it, that was like 2010, I think, 2011. And I had to like revisit and make sure that I'm, and there still was nothing. There was nothing. And I looked again when I started this graphic novel, and there was nothing, on this particular type of resistance, of like coordinated acts of violent resistance. Like, I mean, something about women could like individually, like, it wasn't so, I guess, triggering to think about a woman poisoning her owner's food or setting fire to something or that kind of thing. Like the revolt that I uncovered in 1708 in Queens, I found out about it because it had been described as this individual woman who killed her master and their family. In like Herbert Apthecker's American Negro Slave Revolts, which is like a classic that was written, I don't know, in the 40s or something, 50s. But when I looked into it more, it became like, when I was looking at the 1712 revolt, like the laws on which they based the trial and punishment, it's like, based on this law of slave control that was enacted because of the revolt that happened in 1708. And I looked at that, and it's like, it wasn't just her. There were other enslaved people who were there and involved, or at least prosecuted and executed. But yeah, so I don't know what to say. I think it's this weird thing where now I think younger scholars and people in general are like, yeah, of course. Like they're not stuck in this historiography, but there's still could be so much. There needs to be more work done on that. It's a still very hidden history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like part of what you're saying also speaks to a certain extent to the newness of the field of Black women's history, because it is relatively young, comparatively speaking, right? Like folks have been studying the history of presidents for however long, right? They've been studying European history for so long. But Black history is only maybe 100, 120, if I'm being generous, years old in terms of the sort of professionalization of the field, with Black women's history being even younger. And I think that this is really, I think your work is really a testament to the challenges that people face in doing something new, where you don't have an abundance of sources that are at the ready. You really need to go scour the world for them.
Yeah, but I don't think that it's not, and I know you're not saying this, it's not solely about the newness of the field. It's also the way the field gets prefigured in these very, racialized, gendered ways. Even the term rebellion, like I hate that word. I think I've read too much like John Locke, like in law school, where there's this idea of like rebellion. I think rebellion is like something that like kids do against their parents, or it's kind of outside the field of the political, right? And so I've just been in a lot of conversations where those people say rebellion, and I'm like, rebellion, revolt. And then I'm like, I got to just get over it, because I'm not going to get everyone to read John Locke and what he understands as, what constitutes the political, but the point of that being that the ways we think about the political agency of, what scholars call the subaltern, the people who are located at sort of the lowest level in the society, is just shaped in all these ways that almost makes it unthinkable. Like you have to rethink it,
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a couple more questions for you, but I do want to just share a brief reminder for everyone to please submit your questions to the Q&A box so that we can get to those in a few minutes. Once again, please submit your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So back to you, Dr. Hall. You mentioned just now you briefly mentioned law school, and I'm wondering how your legal background influences the way that you do history, if at all.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's hard for me to say because I don't know necessarily how other people do their historical research, but I know that, colonialists, which is the time period that I'm in, you have to get creative about where you're looking for stuff because there's just not a lot of documentation. But I think having, being an attorney led me to look directly at as many legal sources as I could. So when I went to New York, did the research in 1712, I went to the court records of the trials, and no other historian had looked at those. Which, and then when I was in England, I was doing a lot of research on the law of the slave trade, like where I found out these sort of regulations and how these things existed, and, the business was regulated, and being able to understand it as a business, or like even the Brooks diagram, which is this famous, am I going to be able to pull this up? I'm sure people are familiar with it. It's a diagram of a slave ship and how people are, packed into the slave ship. That was how it was legally allowed to be. And if you look at the diagram, it says right there, the regulated slave trade, and so people are like, oh, this is something the abolitionists made to show how horrible it was. It's like, no, this was actually something made by people regulating the slave trade, saying you can put as this many people on a ship, during the process, during the period of time where there was all this legal back and forth in the House of Lords about how we can ameliorate conditions in the slave trade. Like, we just pass some better safety regulations, and it'll be good. Yeah. So those are things I definitely was very tuned into. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then with what I think is my last question for you before we move on to audience Q&A, why would you say that thinking about slavery matters in the contemporary moment, right? Like, we are currently existing in a time where there is an assault on teaching anything that is incorrectly dubbed critical race theory, right? This boogeyman that's completely divorced from the actual meaning and origins of critical race theory as a legal framework, right? But given that we are in this moment that has, I would say, spurred a racial awakening for many people over the past 2 or so years, with the murder of George Floyd, other instances of police brutality, with Breonna Taylor's death, right? Like, with everything that is wrong with the world at this present moment, and with how difficult it is to teach people about anything having to do with race, why do you think it matters to study slavery today, or to learn about slavery today?
Yeah, well, I mean, the issue, of, police brutality and police murdering Black people, I mean, that's evergreen, right? We know that. But so it always surprises me, like, oh, like, this was the one that, triggered this response, but there are really important things that I feel like if you don't understand the history of slavery in this country, you have no idea why certain things are happening. Like, why is it that where Black people are existing in geography, like you're in this neighborhood or over here or standing over there or in the park watching birds or whatever it is, like, why is that so triggering? And why is there so much, it's like a racialized geography of, and that comes directly from slavery, where geography was racialized, and and why is it that, random, white people, some random white people feel like it's their job or their prerogative or their, position to, like, control Black people's, in space and in geography. It's like, well, because it was, all through, through slavery, and it continued and remained. The connection between the slave patrol and the police, is very clear. But and one of the things, which brought me back to studying this is seeing how, why are Black women constantly seen as somehow like less sensate, less damageable, less, and it's like, in order to create chattel slavery, it was almost like they needed to create two genders of women. There were white women who gave birth to heirs of property, and then there were Black women who gave birth to property. And you can't give birth to property if you're human, right? You're kind of like subhuman, And in 1712 in New York, I mean, they weren't even using the word white. I mean, that was something, it was like, the documents are all like, the people or the Christians, or I mean, just this term white was not even in use, so yeah, I think all of those things. And when people say like, why would you want to even, like I've heard people say like, I didn't want to read your book because it's about slavery. I'm talking about Black people. I don't want to read your book because it's about slavery and I don't want to think about it and it's too traumatic. And I try to address in the last chapter, Ancestry and Progress, about how, like, individual trauma, if you try to block it out, it'll shape you and control you, and there's this way in which you need to bring it in and bring it in front of your eyes so you can see it and integrate it into yourself in order to be empowered by it, and in order to heal from it and then be empowered and understand this, and this is the other part of why it's important, is to understand this incredible legacy of resistance. The fact that we even survived slavery is an amazing achievement, but the fact that it was being resisted every step of the way is so important for people today to know. Like at one of those, George Floyd demonstrations, I saw a picture of this young woman who had a T-shirt that said, "This is not your," why was it? "This is not your."
I am not my ancestors. You can catch these hands, or like one of those types of shirts.
Right. This is not, my ancestors' uprising. Like we're serious now. And it's like I just felt so sad. Because it was like I'm sure she was taught nothing in school. And the information's just not available. So both in terms of understanding race, like if you don't understand the history of slavery, there is no way to understand race in America. Just flat out. But also, if you don't understand resistance, bottom-up resistance in general, but to slavery, then you don't have the tools to keep the fight going.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. Thank you so much. So we are going to move on to audience Q&A now. Our very first one, would you consider Wake, in part or in whole, a work of graphic memoir?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of became that, right? I mean, like I was saying, I didn't expect to put me in it at all, but then I ended up being in it and then talking about my research process, which was memoir. And then there's like a whole half chapter about my grandmother, which I didn't expect till I was actually sitting there writing it. So, being the grandchild of slaves is a really important part of the story of Wake, and also why I do the work that I do. So absolutely, I absolutely feel like it's part memoir. Yeah.
Awesome. Next question. What resources do you recommend for people who are interested in learning more ground truth about the burial grounds and slavery auction sites in New York?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So things have gotten so much better since when I did my dissertation research. I remember like pacing. I mean, I had in the documents where the slave market was, but I was like pacing it off. Now there's a sign, a marker. It's way too small, and it's in front of businesses that made a bunch of money from slavery and the slave trade. So it's kind of, but there is a movement, a kind of grassroots movement to really recover the history of slavery in New York. And I mean, the African Burial Ground is now a national monument, and they have a website and there's lots of information. There was an exhibit at the New York Historical Society called Slavery in New York, and quite a lot of work was done for that. So I mean, there's stuff there. I think there's even people doing like walking tours, like slavery walking tours, in New York. And like the Slavers of New York, which is this group of young people who are doing kind of like guerrilla art in Brooklyn, like, Nostrand Avenue. This Nostrand dude was a slave owner. And so I think people are trying, and there are resources out there, more than ever. And I think it's so important for people to understand slavery as also a northern phenomenon and an urban phenomenon. So, yeah.
All right. Next question. Why is it that Nat Turner is the only slave rebellion taught when there were so many more? And also, how can people find out more about other slave uprisings?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there are plenty of history books written more like kind of by historians, maybe for historians, or like for people studying history at the undergraduate or graduate level, that talk about a lot of different revolts other than Nat Turner. But I actually taught high school for 4 years, and I've seen in textbooks it's the only thing that's there. I don't know that I ever figured out why that is, but yeah, I'll think more about that. But there were hundreds of revolts in the United States. So, going back, I think as early as the Stono Revolt in South Carolina, in what was it? I don't even remember, but it was quite early. So yeah.
Our next question is asking a bit about how you feel doing this work. Do you feel like a detective historian going back over the established history to find the new truths behind it? And do you think we will continue to see this sort of approach on many more periods of history, like different colonial periods, as established narratives become more challenged?
Absolutely. And that's exciting. I think, history, researching history is actually a process of creation. Like I talked to, and, troubling established narratives. Some friends of mine who, talked to me about this book, Wake, they're like, wow, I didn't, like, historians, I didn't know what you all did. I mean, this is like being a investigative journalist. And I'm like, well, or investigative journalists are like historians, people who thought like, oh, you just Google stuff, or history is just pre-existing in books somewhere, So yeah, I think, this book is certainly not the first to try to interrogate some of, dominant narratives about history. And as you were mentioning before, with all of this like critical race theory hysteria, the history is very important. And who has control of the narrative is very important. And people have been sort of fighting against these dominant narratives, for a very long time.
Yeah. Our next question asks, as a previous teacher, do you see historical Black women's efforts to teach during slavery as a method of resistance?
I absolutely would absolutely. Teaching people how to read, teaching people anything. That's clearly a form of resistance. I don't know offhand, maybe you do, of work that's been done specifically about enslaved women educators,
I can't speak specifically about books about enslaved women educators, but there is a relatively new book by Cabria Baumgartner called In Pursuit of Knowledge. And it's a book about Black women's educational activism. This book came out probably 2019 or somewhere around there. And it does focus on Black women educators and Black women's attempts to attend school, including Black girls, not only Black adult women, during the antebellum era. So that might be one resource, though it's not necessarily about Black women who were enslaved and teachers.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have to get through some of these questions. So at this point, I would like to say thank you so much, Dr. Hall, for spending some time with us today. And I will hand it back over to you, Marcia.
And I want to thank you both. This was a wonderful conversation, and what a brilliant way to tell this history, I think. Creative, but not because of the illustrations, obviously creative because of the illustrations, but creative in terms of teaching people history that is hard to teach and hard to discover. So, and thank you so much, Dr. Dennie, for leading such an interesting conversation in so many different directions. I want to say, for those of you who don't know, and because it relates so much to this conversation, that the Center for Brooklyn History has a major public history initiative called Brooklyn Resists. And some of you may know that we have a series called Black Protest, Black Art, about the expression of resistance through different artistic forms. A few weeks ago, we talked about visual art with Dred Scott and Reddy Roy. And I'm saying this to everyone because I hope that you'll explore our upcoming programs. And I think a link will go into the chat, because coming down the pike, we have Jamila Woods talking about expressing resistance, identity through music, and Joshua Bennett, poet Joshua Bennett, and writer Morgan Jerkins, again, discussing these themes expressed through written word. So please explore those, and also know that we've recorded this program tonight, and we will post this on the Center for Brooklyn History YouTube page. Hope that you will, a link to that has gone up in the chat as well, or we'll go, there it is. So you can share it. And again, heartfelt thanks to you both. Thank you for this book. Thank you for this conversation. I hope you have a good night. I hope all of you have a great night, and we'll see you soon, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.